Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having us, and I hope by now that you've worked out which characteristic fits which bloke, and I'm sure I know what it'll be. I think, and obviously Justin's covered a fair bit of what we've got to say, but I should reiterate that I'm the Cattle Council of Australia President. I'm a beef producer, and as Justin said, I live in Northern Australia. Just briefly though, I'd like to give you a little history lesson. We were settled by the British. We inherited British systems, and as Justin said, we have a very arid interior. And it did take a long time for the beef industry in Australia to spread to those areas, but when it did, it was found that in certain seasons cattle did extremely well. But then sometimes after those seasons it didn't rain for some years, and those cattle were caught there. There was no artificial water, they were a long way from market, and that created an environmental situation that just really couldn't be managed in those days. Sometimes we were in a position where cattle were walked from the west coast of Australia to the east coast to be slaughtered. We used the live trade particularly out of the western seaboard of Australia, but we certainly have had a very checkered career with regard to all our markets. And in the 50s, we introduced Bos Indicus cattle to the herd in Australia. And that was coupled with the American market. And I can assure you the American market was a thing that gave the beef industry in Australia a lot of prosperity. But what it did do prior to that, with the British market, they didn't want old cows, they didn't want bulls, they didn't want any of those sort of animals. They only took male animals that were conditioned, and this then had the impact that we could sell cows. I can remember clearly as a child the introduction of that market, and it just really was something that made the Australian beef industry. I have to say though, we're like the Africans. We use cattle as money too, and but when we have a daughter get married, we've got to sell half the herd. Good. Maintaining profitability. Now you've all heard the old one about you've got to be green. You've got to be profitable to be green, and I don't think that's quite it, but it's close enough. I think you get the meaning, and it is of critical importance. But what we've in our industry, we've had great difficulty in making our people understand that more cattle does not necessarily mean more profitability, and that's something that we really are getting there, but it's been a slow road, and there's a long lead up time. We've spent a lot on R&D, but there's a long lead time, and it takes a long time for this to really have an impact. Which one? Too far?
No, you're right.
Right, good. The other challenge that it affects us very seriously is the competition for labour. And as you can see, the mining industry in Australia is creating great wealth for Australia, but it can afford to pay people so much more than the cattle industry can. In fact, an unskilled truck driver, one of those, a driver of that dump truck there would be getting $100,000 plus, and there is no way that we can compete with that. We have, as you can see, we have the use of helicopters to muster and all that sort of thing now, but the critical mass of people in the Australian beef industry is starting to tell. If we can run properties with less people than we ever did, but when it gets down to a situation where you've only got one or two people left, somebody gets hurt, your operation doesn't perform too well. This, of course, engagement and trust and communication, of course, is another major issue for us. And you can see that we've got our colleagues or friends from the WWF who are here with us, and it's quite obvious that we need to engage more with them. We need to engage more with government. We have animal welfare issues, or at least there are organisations around the world that, such as PETA, that have an impact in Australia. And you may well know that mulesing of sheep has been it's been accepted by the industry that it shouldn't be used, and PETA are behind that, and they get some of those wool purchasing companies to boycott that wool if it comes from those sheep. So we've got a long way to go before we engage fully with all these people. Where to next? Well, I think that what I would like to say, we've come here in a spirit of goodwill, and we seriously hope that this occasion leads to much better understanding of each other, and the ultimate winner will be the global beef industry and the environment, and that is probably the greatest challenge of all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.